Hello and welcome to another TLDR US video. On Saturday, former President Donald Trump was acquitted in his Senate trial, with 43 Republicans and no Democrat voting against conviction for his part in the January 6th insurrection. This, to be honest, was pretty much a foregone conclusion by this point. But what wasn't a foregone conclusion was the number of Republicans who would vote for conviction, and that number turned out to be 7. This might not seem like a lot, but for context, before Mitt Romney voted to convict Trump during his first impeachment trial in 2020, the total number of senators in US history that have ever voted to convict an impeached president of their own party was 0. Romney, until last Saturday, was therefore the one and only senator in history to break from party line. And that was only in the Senate. In the House, 10 Republicans voted to impeach Trump after January 6th. And while many Democrats and a number of Republicans have celebrated these moves as being emblematic of a less partisan atmosphere, many state and local GOP groups saw it as something far different: betrayal. This led to a slew of censures and an escalation of the battle between state-level Republicans and federal Republicans, a battle that could have massive implications for the party's future, a battle between Trumism and the traditional Republican Party. Before we start, we're running a special promotion with our Patreon. Every backer, new or old, above $10, gets one of these exclusive golden TLDR pin badges. They're never going to be for sale, so if you want yours, you have to sign up this month. On top of the pin, you'll get all of your usual perks: early access to videos, thanks in videos, behind the scenes post, the ability to vote on topics, exclusive live events, and more. And the satisfying feeling of knowing that you're supporting independent, unbiased news content. Anyway, the link for all of that's in the description. So what's happened since the impeachment vote? Well, 2 of the GOP senators who voted to convict, Bill Cassidy of Louisiana and Richard Burr of North Carolina, have both been censured by their state Republican parties, essentially a strong condemnation from their state parties. Another 2, Ben Sasse of Nebraska and Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, have been censured by county-level Republicans in their respective states. And this isn't to say that the remaining 3, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Susan Collins of Maine, and Mitt Romney of Utah, are out of the woods yet. There are stirrings, especially in Maine, of possible censure. All of this to say, state parties are angry. They're lashing out at their own members of Congress, and, well, they're not new to this. Though Republicans who voted to convict Trump are the most recent recipients of state GOP anger, they're far from the first. After Arizona swung blue in November, the Arizona GOP voted to censure Cindy McCain, widow of the widely popular John McCain, and a powerful figure in her own right in Arizona politics. They did so because of her support for Joe Biden in the 2020 campaign, her support for gay rights in general, and her defense of her late husband when President Trump went on the attack against him. Because, defending your recently deceased husband is truly radical action. But Arizona Republicans didn't stop there. Included in their spree of censures was their former Senator Jeff Flake and their current governor Doug Ducey. And while McCain and Flake endorsed now President Biden, Ducey did nothing of the sort. In fact, he's not even a particularly moderate Republican. His flaw? Well, all he did was admit that Trump lost the election in Arizona. As a side note, I might point out that of all the possible reactions to Democrats winning both the presidential and Senate race in the state for the first time in decades, Arizona Republicans' censuring of their current governor and multiple very popular figures of their party was perhaps not, from a purely strategic standpoint, the wisest decision. Were I the AZ GOP, and had I just watched my own red state turn blue, my first reaction probably wouldn't be, well, let's shrink our tent yet further. But anyway, it's worth noting that not every state has gone as censure-happy as Arizona, or the likes of Pennsylvania. The latter of which, on a county level, voted to censure Pat Toomey before he even voted to convict. Utah's Republican Party, for example, issued a statement after the acquittal vote praising both of its senators, one of whom voted to convict and the other who voted to acquit, displaying the state party's openness to diverse thought. And really, even the states that have censured their senator haven't really done anything beyond shout at said senator. Because censure, it should be noted, is nothing more than a fancy angry note. I mean, speaking of the aforementioned McCain family, Senator McCain was censured by the AZ GOP after leaving office, as well as during his tenure, and he still won re-election quite comfortably. The question really is, are these censures indicators for what the statewide electorate thinks in places like Arizona, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina? And, well, we might have to wait a bit for the answers there. Why? Because while 3 of the 7 who voted to convict are up for re-election in 2022, 2 of those 3 are retiring, and the remaining 4 aren't up for another 4 to 6 years. 2 of the retiring senators are Burr and Toomey, who you might remember as having faced particularly harsh backlash from their states. The other one who's up in 22 and is running for re-election is Lisa Murkowski. Murkowski comes from Alaska, who recently changed their electoral system, and that's significant. They've changed from the standard primary and general elections to a system in which an all-party primary will be held, from which the top 4 will advance to the general election, which itself will use ranked choice voting to determine the winner. All of which is basically to say, Murkowski suddenly has a lot less to worry about in the coming midterm. Plus, she's already lost a primary before, and after that happened, she went on to win as an independent write-in candidate. So, if you're looking for an average senator, perhaps you'll have to look elsewhere. In the past few minutes, though, we've only really talked about senators, and that's because the situation in the lower house is a tad different. Because House members are up every 2 years, all of the controversial establishment Republicans, from Liz Cheney to Adam Kinzinger, are likely to face a primary fight ahead of 2022. Whether such politicians can hang on through the coming elections will give us the best indicator we have as to which way the voters themselves are heading. But the difference between the House and Senate situations gets at a broader issue that's really at the heart of this whole mess. Local and state level Republicans are notably and perhaps even increasingly different from their national counterparts. 538's Perry Bacon Jr. wrote a very good article on this, which I highly recommend you read after watching this video. But in essence, he found that state parties were sliding much faster than the national GOP in the direction of reactionary white identity politics. That state power was, in many ways, Trumpism before Trump. It's usually state-level Republicans, not federal Republicans for example, who push towards things like making it harder for people of colour to vote or banning the 1619 Project in schools. And while some federal Republicans have been critical recently of their colleagues, it's largely state parties who are making moves against their Republican Congress members. Perhaps the best example here is Representative Liz Cheney. After she voted to impeach President Trump, she faced 2 votes, one among her House Republican colleagues as to whether she should keep her leadership role, and one among the Wyoming GOP Central Committee members as to whether she should be censured. The former she won overwhelmingly, keeping her seat as chair of the House Republican Conference. The latter she lost by an even larger margin, with only 8 of the 74 members of the Wyoming committee voting against censure. So yeah, I think it's safe to say there's a bit of a divide here. In the 538 article mentioned a moment ago, Bacon tried to identify the source of this divide. And while there are a number of potential causes, some are more easy to point out than others. First is the media, which is heavily centered in on Washington. And while it's easy to critique, it's also easy to see how this has happened. I mean, 50 states is a lot to cover. It's more practical in many ways for news outlets to concentrate their coverage on national issues. While distant from most, it will be something that most people can identify with. While outlets that focus on state issues will, by default, have a lower ceiling in terms of the number of people who could possibly be interested. I mean, we do this too. Much as some of our writers may occasionally be tempted to, we can't only focus on Maine, or any other state for that matter. Like any news organisation with a spread out audience, we focus on broader issues. All of this is to say that state issues often face a lot less scrutiny. A bill in Washington that restricts voting rights will be shredded for weeks on national TV. An identical bill in, say, Alabama would perhaps garner a few national news stories for a day or two. Keeping an eye on every state is hard, especially when there's so many of them doing so many different things at once. Then there's the issue of establishment. Put simply, national politicians are often more able to stay in place for a lot longer. Think of the senators that have been in Washington for large swathes of your life. I mean, the current president served in the institution for 36 years before spending 8 years as vice president. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has been a senator since 1985. Because of this, dislodging national characters is hard, but dislodging local leaders with smaller power structure and often shorter terms, well, that's a whole lot easier. In fact, you don't even need to leave Washington to see this play out. You can see it going on one rung down on the political ladder. The House holds elections every 2 years. In order for a House member to have served for the same amount of time McConnell will have done when his current term expires, he's on his 7th term by the way, they would have had to win 21 consecutive elections. Now this was by design. House members, as well as state and local officials, were set out by the national and state constitutions to be more directly responsive to the voters, while senators represented the state governments themselves. This means more changes for the House than the Senate. And one certainly could argue that the presence of a political establishment is a net negative, but one could also make the opposite argument, that the establishment is holding us back from reactionary politics that are actively damaging democracy. For now though, it appears that this divide between establishment moderates and local reactionaries is in no mood to close, and if the recent censures are anything to go by, it would seem instead only to be widening. What do you think though? Are these censures actually representative of what people want to happen in the states? Or are they just a reactionary measure from angry state officials? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, as well as what you expect to happen next in this situation. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.